as a starter, and that can get you to the other question of, do you trust your food? And if so, why? Why do you trust your food? Um, this talk is a slightly expanded version of a talk that I did earlier this year on campus. And it's one where I gave a basic overview of the book's theme and contents. And it's one where I started with a story that I tell to begin one of the earlier chapters. I won't assume that you've read it, though some people here may have. I want to start with a quote just so I have it in the background. From the 17th century, from this guy Rochefoucauld, in every walk of life, men assume the expression and manner which they believe will make them as they would wish to be regarded. Thus, one might say that our world consists entirely of face values, as in what you see is what you get. Um, Now, the story that I was going to start with is one that this quote reminds me of. Right when I was beginning to write this book, which is maybe not quite 10 years ago. It took a while to do it, and I didn't actually work at Lafayette yet. Um, I was introducing uh, a food documentary, a local food documentary at a film festival. This was in Virginia, and after the film screened, it was a pretty big packed room. There was, as part of an organization, and we were kind of in charge of taking charge of this film. And a guy walks up to me, and he's got the Stetson hat on, and he shakes my hand. He wants to introduce himself, and he says, "Hey, I just wonder if we could meet and talk more about what your group is doing." I thought, sure, that's fine, of course. That it wasn't uncommon for people to ask for conversations. Farmers and gardeners and local food advocates in town where I lived were often talking about this, and I was kind of the head of this organization, so it made sense. So he said, "Why don't we meet at this coffee shop, next week, and we can talk through some things." And thinking, "Oh, okay, he's not really telling me what he wants to talk about. He seems a little strange, but I can't quite register what it is yet." But I agreed. I said, "Okay, we'll meet." And he says, "We'll meet at such and such a coffee shop." I said, "I know where that is because I actually do a lot of work there. I get a lot of writing done at coffee shops." And I had just been there that week reading a book called The Confidence Man, which is a novel by Herman Melville. It's a novel from 1857, and it turned out to play quite a big role in this book. And he wanted to meet to talk there. So I said, "Okay, we'll go." And we meet there, and he's there before I get there, and he's already kind of set up on this couch in front of this low table, and he's got a set of books stacked there. And I was like, I don't something, you know, made me pause. I think I don't know what I'm walking into or what this guy wants, but he's got some kind of presentation for me. Is he after money? Is he after support? Is he after a job? It wasn't very clear. But I'm thinking about his manner and expression and the face values here. And I tell him, I've only got like 20 minutes um, just to kind of put a timer on it. But we can meet again next week if you want. He's like, "Oh, maybe, but I might be moving to New Mexico." And this is like a Thursday, and it's like, "Well, we can meet on like Tuesday." It's like, "Well, I'm not sure if I'll be here." I was like, "You're moving to New Mexico on Tuesday, but you don't know yet, and now it's Thursday." He's like, "Yeah, I'm part of this ministry, and we're doing a lot of work." And it wasn't clear to me if he was the minister, if he was starting a ministry, or if he was actually part of a functioning ministry, what this ministry did. So I kind of looked at him a little side-eyed and agreed still. I was like, "All right, let's sit down and talk." He starts talking through this series of books, and he's telling me we're all riding on spaceship Earth, and we've all got to get along. And he's telling me about these divining rods. He's got a new technique to find water, and I'm wondering where this is going. And I have this Melville book in the back of my head, since I was almost sitting in the exact chair that we were sitting in, called The Confidence Man. And eventually, we end the conversation. I shake hands. He says, "Thanks for your time." I'm still not sure what we were talking about or what he wants. I decide I should Google him again. I hadn't found any information before, but I Google him. I don't find any information, and then just as I'm doing this, I get an email from him really quickly, which is a summary. It's like, "It's really glad to meet you. We're all walking on spaceship Earth here together, and the mission of my ministry is really important. And in order to help achieve that, I need some money." It's like, okay, that's what I thought. He was after money. He was looking to me as a mark, as a way to try to secure a donation, and I don't even know what's going on here. Um, the reason it struck me is because um, Melville's book, The Confidence Man, comes out 6 years after Moby Dick. Um, it's playing off the term confidence man, which was coined in 1849. Um, Melville uses it as his title 8 years later because the term had so quickly become subsumed in everyday culture. We don't use the whole phrase anymore. Now we just say con man. But at first they would call it, in the 19th century, it was called a confidence man. And the point of a confidence man was someone who could gain your confidence to trick you. And Melville's long and elaborate book here, which is very good, it's a great read, is all about these key terms of trust and confidence and authenticity and sincerity, about being genuine or its opposite, disingenuous, and a lot about character. The Confidence Man, the book is, it's, just to give a thumbnail sketch, because this talk is not about the Confidence Man. Um, the book itself is about a steamboat that's going up the Mississippi, and it's characters who are interacting with one another, and they're all trying to trick each other. So someone would say, "Excuse me, sir, would you have enough confidence in me to give me $100?" And then you would say, like, "No, who are you? I don't even know you." He's like, "Well, what could I do to gain your confidence so that you would give me $100?" And it's all these elaborate plays about trust, and it's all these elaborate plays about face value. So, like, are you really who you appear to be? Does the surface match the interior? It's that difference between surfaces and interiors that dominates this book. It was that impulse, or that axis between surfaces and interiors, that struck me when I was talking to the guy at the Stetson hat at the coffee shop. Are you really who you say you are? And because I was interested in thinking about the history of food and the origins of manufactured food, I was struck and pulled into a debate that raged in the 19th century that was asking, is that food really what you say it is? Are you tricking me, or are you selling me the genuine article? Um, the key here is that trusting food means trusting people. And that's probably the log line for the whole book. So here then is this book, Pure Adulteration, which is ostensibly about the origins of manufactured foods. Or the book itself uses arguments over purity and adulteration as its main thread. Adulterated is a term that's not as often used anymore, so it's not common parlance the way it had been. But adulterated meant deceptive or contaminated or corrupted. Adulterated as in not pure. Um, the book offers a picture of when and how in the United States we started to make foods in factories and not just harvest them from fields or process them as part of agrarian communities. That's a story that's roughly from the 1860s to the 1910s. The end of the story leaves us with the founding of the FDA and the underpinnings of modern food regulation. It leaves us, that is, with the underpinnings of our current food system. They were born in the early 1900s. Um, I want to read the end of I was putting this together. I want to read the end of the prologue to the book, which I think captures what I was going to paraphrase anyways. So I might as well actually just stick with the text. Um, Beyond this part, I'm not going to just read from the book to you. So um, I'll ask for your patience on this part. So you'll find there that debates over purity and adulteration provide a window onto the origins of manufactured foods and the perceived problems that they wrought. Indeed, disputes of what was then called the era of adulteration, this period between the 1860s and the early 1900s, revealed confusing new tensions in the ways that people understood, bought, trusted, and ate their food. Cultural factors help explain why anybody cared. They show that a prevailing suspicion of cheats, deceivers, hucksters, and confidence men, con men, and a corollary fervor for sincerity, authenticity, and honesty, that those provided the foundation from which the era of adulteration was born. Environmental factors help explain why the prevailing cultural concerns were exacerbated. So new supply chains, complex commodity flows, far-flung land use patterns, theretofore unknown ingredients, they all formed a new infrastructure of food and agriculture that made the view from farm to fork thick and opaque. You didn't know where your food was coming from. So you take those together, that host of cultural and environmental conditions, they shaped the pure food crusades and the set of chemists and analysts and public health officials that were bent on commandeering and policing the concept of purity, of defining what counts as a pure food. So whereas into the mid-19th century, so by the middle of the 1800s, it was still common to understand your food based on its origins, based on its provenance. and based on its purveyors. By the early 20th century, the concept of purity had moved from its agricultural setting and relocated into the hands of the analyst and the lab. Purity had become a scientific concept that was that was policed by government agencies and backed by certified analysis. So it would be the analysts and the scientists who would draw that line between purity and adulteration. Because in a nutshell, the whole story here is about how do you draw that line between them. They don't just exist out in the world. You have to decide what counts as pure and what counts as adulterated. So in this book, Pure Adulteration looks to the Pure Food Crusades to tell the story about cultures of authenticity and manufactured foods of questionable purity. Along the way, it shows the ways farmers, manufacturers, grocers, housewives, government officials, scientific analysts, customers, consumers, they all sought to demarcate and patrol the ever contingent, always contested line between purity and adulteration. This book about Pure Food Crusades is about how people drew that line. There is and was no natural pre-human distinction that we can simply uncover and enforce. We have to decide where to draw it and how to police it. So granted that today's world is much different from that of our 19th century forebears in so many ways. But the challenge of policing the difference between acceptable and unacceptable practices remains central to our decisions about the foods we eat, how we produce them, and what choices we make when we're buying them. So that's how the kind of the prologue starts and gets the book going. For our sake today, I'll canvas like the main body of the book. The question here is, how could you know that new manufactured foods were okay to eat? How could you know if someone wasn't trying to pull one over on you? Pure foods, maybe like organic or natural foods today, that's what you wanted. You wanted pure foods. People feared that new foods were adulterated. They thought they were corrupted and tainted. And maybe they'd cheat your wallet and maybe they'd make you sick. That means, put another way, the book explains how and why people understood, resisted, and then reshaped this new food system that we eventually call industrial and modern. In other words, the one we have now. So in the first section of the book, part one, I address the culture of adulteration, all those big key terms: trust, sincerity, authenticity, character, face values, confidence, genuine, and pure. This is the part that it includes the story of the man in the Stetson hat. But it begins with a different con man who becomes the baseline for the book. Actually, Chris knows this guy because I talked about him before to alumni maybe 5 years ago. This guy, Alfred Peroff, embodied all the things that I wanted to get at in the book. He's not really known now, unless you read the book. He's a chemist. He's a French chemist. He's a world traveler, and he's a con man. Papers called him the king of swindlers. One paper described him as a man with, quote, the form and features of an Apollo to match the polished manners of a citizen of the world. Another paper called him handsome, polished, well-educated, known for his keen intelligence and ready wit. I love that he's got like a wax tip mustache. He just kind of looks the part. A Brooklyn Daily said of him that he stood above and beyond his fellows who, compared with him, were mere bunglers in operations which he had reduced to an exact science and of which he was the greatest exponent. He was striking too, physically. They said he had the suave address of a gentleman. And yes, of course, he had that wax tip mustache, a twizzled mustache, one person said. His big swindle, how was he the foremost swindler of his age? He was running the margarine con. Margarine, as in fake butter. This was in the 1870s, as margarine had been invented in 1869. The issue at hand is that you might not know what you're getting when you buy your food. And this guy could rise to be such a prolific and reviled figure of swindling, hucksterism, and charlatanism, a con man, for tricking people with this new upstart product called margarine or fake butter. They called it oleomargarine at the time. This question about how you know what you're getting when you buy your food becomes a much bigger problem when you have to buy your food from somewhere else, when it's someone outside your agrarian world. For that reason, the next part of the book puts a spotlight on the grocer's market, because the grocer is a main mediator between you and your food. These weren't like our grocery stores now where you pick up packaged goods from a shelf. That model of what you'd call a self-service grocery develops in the 20th century. The ones in the 19th century, called a grocer's market, not a grocery store, um, these were much more like pharmacies, where the grocer handed you the product across a counter. Those grocers were often accused of adulterating the food behind the counter. This is actually an early one. This is from 1855, a British satirical paper called Punch. If you can't read the bottom, I'll read the quote or the caption. There's a little girl who's asking for the food across the counter, and she says, "If you please, sir, mother says, will you let her have a quarter a pound of your best tea to kill the rats with, and an ounce of chocolate as will get rid of the black beetles?" And you can see that under the counter it's full of poisons. Sand, red lead, plaster Paris, and other adulterating agents. So they're picking on the fact that grocers are trying to cheat you and they're not to be trusted. And now that these grocers are proliferating because people are living in cities, there's greater and greater concern. I talk about the ways that this new middleman developed trust and faith of the customer. What do they have to do to garner the trust so that their face value was legitimate, so that what you see is what you get? Much of that had to do with chemical analysis, so that by the 20th century, grocers were hiring chemists to verify for customers that their goods were what they said they were. Or it depended on a new genre of domestic science, where housewives could learn techniques of chemical detection on their own so they could check it themselves in the kitchen. That actually comes up later in the book too, so I'll just leave it mentioned here for now, except I also want to show another cartoon because I like the cartoons in the book. This is another one. This is a preeminent chemist. You notice that this is almost a half century after the first one. And if you look under the counter, it kind of has the same assortment and a more elaborate assortment of poisons. I don't know how clever they were. The place is called A. Devil and Company, manufacturer of pure food. It's a little on the nose, but I guess it had a broad audience. Poison, salicylic acid, plaster of Paris, starch paste, sawdust, borax, coal tar. And the gentleman here is supposed to be representing Harvey Wiley, who's a name that I'll return to soon, one of the most famous men addressing this at the time. So that's the section one. You get a sense of what's this culture of adulteration? Why are people worried and how are they encountering these issues? Part two is called the geography of adulteration. And this section explains the growing geography of new manufactured foods and suspected adulterants with three prime cases. And I drew all three cases from this cartoon that came out in 1887. The three cases are oleomargarine. You can see that one neck. This is called the hydra-headed beast of adulteration. One of the heads is of oleomargarine. One of them is called cottonseed oil lard. And the third one is called glucose. I'll say a little bit about each of these. You can see that on the trunk of the neck, the whole thing is called fraud. You've got all these robber baron guys with the hats, the industrialists who are urging on fraud. And then you've got the farmer there with his musket, and the pig and the cow being chased away by all these fakes. So I took each one of these three as the main case studies. I think there's a couple of people on this call who helped me quite a bit figure this stuff out. So if this was in gallery view still, like Matt could raise his hand and Jay could raise his hand, and way to go. So we've already seen this first case, oleomargarine, in reference to our guy Alfred Paraff. People thought this was fake butter, and therefore they thought it was bad. What I'm after in the big middle of the book is that these new supposed adulterants were integrated in vast geographical networks that span the globe. And that means that any assessment of good versus bad, which is kind of what you're saying when you say pure versus adulterated, which is kind of like natural versus artificial. They were all dabbling with these contrasts. That these were far more environmentally entangled than just a matter of the final contents at the store. It was also about the process, and it was about the agricultural production. I won't say much more about oleomargarine. It's fascinating. There's a whole chapter on it. There's actually several stories in other chapters too. But the term oleo dropped off for the most part by the early to mid 20th century. The controversy over oleomargarine lasted the longest of the three of these. You're alum, so I don't know the years you graduated, but you may have recollection of having to color your margarine because it was not allowed to be colored. I see we've got renovated butter stamp in the background of one of the alum. So certainly people have personal experience with oleo or margarine being held off as a separate entity. The reason you had to color it is because it was illegal to create the appearance that margarine was butter. You couldn't trick the customer. You couldn't deceive their face values. It had to be what you thought it was. So there's a series of laws that go on for decades, making sure that customers and consumers could tell the difference. The second case is cottonseed oil. And before I say anything about that one, I should have noted that some of the things that Matt Pushka and Jay Kasakov and maybe a handful of other students at Lafayette helped me build was a pretty elaborate map page. This is the opening page. This is purefood.lafayette.edu. So the library here helped us build this, and you can tab over to a lot of things. So if you tab on maps, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 different pages, which will show commodity flow maps of each of these 3 things. And I'll show some of these in a second. The first one was margarine. And what we did was map the export of margarine so you could see the volume of how many hundreds of millions of pounds of margarine the United States was shipping out to the world. So I don't expect you to be able to read the entirety of this map right now. It's a little too small, and it's hard to grab on the screen. I wanted to show it so you could get a sense of the entanglement and the elaborate complexity that there's a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of margarine going to a lot of places, up to and close to 1 billion pounds a year by 1900. The second case that I study is cottonseed oil. And I'll show you the first of 2 maps here. Most people may not even know what that is or that it was a thing. The cotton harvesting process long had a byproduct of discarded seeds. And those seeds were usually heaped on the side of the field, and they were sometimes used for cattle, but they were generally wasted, sometimes used for cattle feed, but it was mostly wasted. After the Civil War, however, they began to call this stuff the Cinderella of the South, the ignored stepchild who blossomed into a recognized beauty, because the Southerners would actually crush these seeds and get oil out of them, and then they would broker deals to sell this oil to others. So the first thing that they did was they brokered deals with Italian olive oil makers, because when you crush the seeds to express the oil of cotton seeds, that oil's consistency and texture were reasonably similar to olive oil. So you could thus mix it in, and you could save money, and then you could import it back to the US, and you'd slap a pure label on it, falsely attached to the exterior. So that was one route for this new Cinderella of the South, over to the Mediterranean, back to the East Coast. The second route for this new Cinderella of the South was a revenue stream that came from selling it to meat packers in Chicago. Those meat packers were big lard salesmen too, pig fat. They would cut the lard with cottonseed oil, and therefore they would have a cheaper shortening that was used for cooking and kitchen management. So now you're using cottonseed oil for cooking and for shortening. This is where you probably actually have heard of cottonseed oil, though you might not know it. Procter & Gamble came out with a popular shortening in the early 1900s that was called Crisco. If I could see the whole gallery view, I'd say, hey, raise your hand if you've heard of Crisco. And everybody's like, yes, of course, I've heard of Crisco. This is not a dramatic point. We get it, Crisco. Crisco is actually, in its original name, it's a contraction of its main ingredient. It's crystallized cottonseed oil. That's what Crisco stands for. Now, they use other vegetable oils for the shortening now. They don't use cottonseed anymore, but that's where the name comes from. So you actually have heard of cottonseed oil, even if it wasn't obvious. This was, something that I learned too. I didn't actually know that when I started the book. I had this map, and I was going to toggle between 2. So here's 1880 and 1900. And in this case, the drama is, oh, look, it's a lot more. So you can see this ever-increasing quantity. And I really wish we could get Matt Pliszka to jump in here to say how much time he had to spend poring over very dry journals to collect the data so we could do this to this. There's more than just this, but it was a very labor-intensive process to figure out and track how much cottonseed oil was going to how many places around the world. Now, the third case is glucose. I'll just give you one map for glucose. I know that now that's a reference to blood sugar, the term glucose. But in the late 1800s, it was the name for sugar that was derived usually from corn. So it was corn sugar or corn syrup. It was the original corn syrup. It was likewise reviled for the offense of seeking to trick customers who wanted pure sugar. So in the case of margarine, we've got fake butter versus real butter, or at least people who made the argument that one was fake and one was real, and therefore one was bad and one was good. Because these arguments were so contentious, many people would also say, just because it's fake doesn't mean it's bad. And that's an argument that would take a long time to resolve, and we may still be involved in it. Cottonseed oil, it's either real olive oil or it's cut with cottonseed oil. It's either real lard or it's fake lard. Now in the case of glucose, it's either real sugar or it's fake sugar, this upstart glucose. So it was reviled for the offense of seeking to trick customers who wanted this so-called pure sugar. And at the time, pure sugar was either cane sugar or beet sugar. Cane sugar comes from the tropics. Beet sugar comes from more northern climes, such as the American Midwest or Europe. In fact, if you want a trivia question, I think I say this in the book too, the biggest sugar producer in the late 1800s globally was, I'll pause for effect, Germany. Because they made so much beet sugar in Germany that they outproduced anybody else in the world in terms of actual poundage of sugar. I think for the sake of time today, I'm actually not going to say more about this case, but I'll say that I look forward to your thoughts on it after you read the book. So the middle of the book canvases these geographies of adulteration so that when we're trying to encounter and understand where did these adulterants come from, not just do I like them or do I not like them, but why do we even have them? You start to understand that these are products of a new industrial era, and the question of purity and adulteration is really a question of, are we okay with an industrialized food system? And because people were not okay with it, this is a very controversial time period. Now I'll move on to the third part. And this section is about the analysis of adulteration, which is carefully called the analysis of adulteration. This one shows how new scientific and analytical techniques to identify and define purity replaced older techniques that were more place-based and agrarian and experiential. Those older ways of understanding purity and adulteration came from within agrarian communities. So adulteration has always been around. We have comments on this from the Bible. Plato talks about it. It's thousands of years old. It's not like adulteration is new in the 1800s. It's not new. As long as we've had food adulteration. What happens in the 19th century is that we're losing our ability to keep track of it or to understand it or to police it because it's no longer bound within agrarian communities. Now it's global. Now it's urban. Now it's, cross-Atlantic, transatlantic. So you don't know where your food is coming from in the same way. Here's where the chemists come in because they're going to be able to analyze this food for you and tell you if it's okay, if it's really what it says it is. The key in this last part is that these new technologies of food identity were given form by the cultural and the environmental circumstances of those prior decades. It didn't come from nowhere. So part of this section paints a picture of local and regional groups putting together their argument that we needed to fight for pure food with new science. One of my favorite sources here, this is a cartoon from 1884. I showed a Puck one earlier. Puck is the onion of its day. So this was taking jabs at it. Look before you eat and see if you can discover any unadulterated food, the premise being that you can't, and that you need this set of contraptions just to know what's on your kitchen table. So he's got the sand extractor because they were very fearful that sugar was being mixed with sand. They're trying to make a buck by cutting the sugar down. You've got the milk tester to check your pure Orange County milk, which just like today, with all these milks, the milk and the butter would come in from the countryside and you slap this beautiful label on it. It would look like an idyllic, bucolic countryside imagery, wonderful cows, but it was cut with water or reduced, and on and on. So you need a whole arsenal of chemical equipment just to know if your dinner is safe. So in the first part of this section, I kind of study this at the regional scale to find out how cities and metropolitan boards are dealing with this in Washington and New York and Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis. How are cities coming to figure this out? And then I pulled scope back out in the last chapter to the national level where chemists are working in the USDA and specifically the Bureau of Chemistry, which is a part of the USDA, to lead the way in this same fight. The main guy there is a gentleman that I showed you a picture of earlier, 10, 15 minutes ago, Harvey Wiley. They called it the Pure Food Crusades in this cartoon. If I was complaining earlier that it was the earlier one was a little bit on the nose, this one is even more on the nose. He's actually, driving a crusade. The tip of the spear is chemical analysis. He's chasing away the devil of impure food. He's got his shield to protect him. Sir Death, ye knight of impure food, by noble knight so hot pursued, no longer wears a merry mood, ye smile that won't come off. Because Harvey Wiley's on the path, and he's going to detect this impure food, and then everything's going to be okay. We care about this kind of stuff because all these efforts, everything I'm talking about, led to the founding of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. That happened after the passage of a very famous 1906 Pure Food Act. I think in general, people, if they've heard of the Pure Food Act, might think of Upton Sinclair and the Jungle. That book came out in 1906. It came out in February of 1906, and the law passed in June. It was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back. Teddy Roosevelt got a copy. It sold, tens of thousands of copies within weeks. But it certainly wasn't a new point in 1906. It was just the last point to finally get this bill over the hill. Congress had tried for the last quarter century approximately 190 times to pass pure food legislation. So this was just the one that finally worked in 1906. While food regulations have indeed changed over the century, there are always new layers that are wrapped around the old ones, like an onion, so that as we sit here, the ideas and the structure of food safety and agricultural policy of a century ago remain at the core of how we understand the right way to police the boundary between purity and adulteration, between acceptable and unacceptable foods. Because that's the book proper, I want to finish here with two thoughts for us. One is that when we're arguing over the validity of new foods, of new agricultural practices, of something like genetic modification of GMOs, or additives, food additives, or if almond milk is really milk, or if the Impossible Burger is really a burger. What we're really doing in that is arguing over where the line is between acceptable and unacceptable. And more to the point, we're having a political debate over authority. Like, who gets to decide what's in and what's out? Who has that authority? Why do we believe them? Why do we trust them? Still, as with the dawn of manufactured food, trusting food now means trusting people. And a final thought is that we used to make these decisions from the grounding of much fuller environmental lives as part of agrarian communities, as defined by the contours of the growing season and the demands of building a flourishing agrarian life. No more, like none of us live in that world. We're consumers now. We're separate from the production of food. We're beholden to the choices made at the market, which means we depend on labels and we depend on certification. We depend on these verifiers of authenticity, which aren't us. Like, we have to trust somebody else to verify that something is authentic. But we could build new forms of engagement with our food system that connect us to these environmental lives rather than disconnect us. And that could be our future. That could be a different way that we think about what it means to trust our food and what it means to live in an authentic, sincere, and legitimate food system. I'm going to leave it at that, and thank you for your time, and open it up for any questions that you have. Chris, I don't know if I should stop the screen share. Hey, look, there's the cover again. Everybody's got it?
I think you could, oh, there we go. So we have everyone muted right now. If anyone wants to put questions in the chat feature, or we can, Ben, if you would like to open up, we can do that too.
I guess I don't mind if we just open it up. I don't think everybody's gonna jump in. There's a hand raising feature too, if people know how to do that. I don't mind if people can speak.
All right, I've now allowed people to be able to unmute themselves. Mary Lee, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, you're welcome to do that.
Okay, I typed it in the chat too. Thank you so much for that presentation. I haven't read your book, and I've been interested in nutrition topics for about 15 or 20 years since I took some cooking classes with Christina Perello. She learned from macrobiotic chefs, and that kind of piqued my interest in nutrition. Recently, I was looking at the USDA's revised My Plate, you know, the new food pyramid recommendations.
Right.
So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit with the idea of purity and adulteration and the way the face values or whatever speaks to the recommendations that are made, because these recommendations affect literally millions of lives. Because, for example, school lunches have to be based on the nutrition guidelines that the USDA puts out there. And so, you know, whether we're advising people based on actual science or on with respect to, I don't know, interests that are more industry favorable. I just wonder if you came across anything about that in your research, and how this line between purity and adulteration also speaks to like the values and the recommendations from science that we give to our society, and then the impacts that has.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Part of the issue, or one thing that you find from the book, is what they grappled with in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, was that science was both the cause of and solution to the problems. So it's different people, where you could get chemists working for companies to fabricate these new products, and those were problematic. But you also have chemists who are working to identify and defend and protect people. So you'd always have both of those at the same time. What it meant by the 20th century is that we had agreed in terms of policy and regulation that some kind of scientific protocol was the way to understand food identity. And that was very much indebted to new nutritional science that was pretty much born and invented in this time period too. So people that Harvey Wiley worked with are the ones who, there's a guy, W.O. Atwater, is often known as the father of modern nutrition. And what they did was, discover vitamins and discover the constitution of food groups, so that then they could create these structures of, well, what counts as healthy and what counts as unhealthy. And that allowed us to get to USDA serving recommendations in USDA portions, and even the invention of the calorie, which is before we get like the food plate or the USDA like My Plate, but sits underneath it. Like, what is a calorie? That began as it's a unit of energy. So physicists and scientists are working on a calorie as, how much energy does it take to burn something. And they realize, well, this is the same thing for food. Food is energy. And these things get all bundled together in the early 20th century to compose dictates for what should count as healthy foods. It changes quite a lot over the next 80, 100 years, so that whatever we get out of the early 1900s is going to be different, like for us to talk about the My Plate. But what's similar is an assumption that a wide diversity of people's eating habits, a wide diversity of cultural traditions and cooking techniques and household management practices can all be reduced to a specific quantitative measure. So you have to make a great diversity of eating patterns much more uniform. And you can do that with numbers and with science, so that you can provide a regulation that applies to all school systems the same way, all people the same way. And that's one half of it. The other half of it, I think, is what you're also getting at in your question, which is that it really is the FDA law, or the Pure Food Law in the early 1900s, 1906, that provides the basis for having industry input into these laws. Really, the industries, they weren't that opposed to the Pure Food Act, because they knew that they could have a say in defining what pure food was. It gave them more power to do that. And that too is something that I think we still see a century later, is the investment by industries and the producers of the food to make sure they have their voice in the policy-making process, so that whatever turns out to fit on the USDA plate happens to be the product that they're selling. Oh, here's a typed question. Should I do the typed question?
Nope.
Couple of questions here too, and then someone who might like to share some insights on margarine.
Do you want me to handle this one? The dietary supplement industry of the present day is a bit like the 19th century food industry.
I'm afraid I'm looking at a different one. I have one. How weak is the FDA now? I'm paranoid that it's cheaper for companies to risk paying a fine for inaccurate labels, given how likely they are to get caught. Is there anyone policing food labels, especially pet food labels, anymore?
I should have said at the beginning of the talk that as a historian, I'm what they would call a continuist, as opposed to a discontinuous, where I don't really see much change over time. We have new things. The circumstances and the material conditions of our lives change. So we're not the same now as we were in 1906. But the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve and the acrimony over regulation and political control are strikingly similar to the way they were 100 years ago. So that I don't have that much faith that there's going to be a government entity which can fully, I won't say we, I'll say that I can fully trust to have my interest in mind and not the corporate benefactors. That reveals a little bit of my own kind of worldview. But part of that also comes out of studying this period where we're put into position of consumers. We're no longer farmers. You know, it's 50% of the labor force in the early 1900s is still agrarian, and now it's 2%. So we're not really living on the land. We don't have these connections. So we have to invest our trust in some external agency. And that just begets more confusion and more distrust, because now we have to trust the agency instead of trusting the food. And I obviously, you know, I'm rambling because I don't have a good answer for it, because I don't know that it's that hopeful just to keep building more political regulation unless it's backed by a change in who pays for that. And right now they're paid for by the industries that are being regulated, all the way to pet foods.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. One, in your final comment, you mentioned the possibilities of new ways of getting to know our food. Do you have an example of something you have thought of?
Oh yeah. I mean, I work with so many students here on campus, and you know, work probably for 20 years now in what we generally call the local food movement. And I often like to think of that as the regional food movement. It's not just cities or towns, but it's regions like the Lehigh Valley or maybe the Mid-Atlantic. And that opens up so many in terms of how we participate in our food system, even if we're not farmers. So things like, yes, things like farmers markets, things like public markets, things like community supported agriculture, things like community gardens, things like food hubs, things like local hunger organizations, things like the college farm. You know, we have a great thriving farm here at Lafayette. Students don't come to Lafayette because they're going to become farmers. So we don't have a farm because we're training agriculturalists, but it's a great means to learn about connections with the land and our connections with the soil, and why healthy soil is so important. There's so many things throughout the day and throughout the week that we can do to become more part of our food system, instead of just cleaving it off and saying, it's just whatever I buy at the store. So we can develop smaller markets. I think we're seeing in the pandemic right now a necessary resurgence and proliferation of smaller and regional producers and smaller and regional markets. So even if that's not me personally, if I'm not going to be the farmer, I can work within these systems, and I can change my consumer habits so that I'm part of the growing practices and not always just completely outside them.
Ben, I think that actually started to answer another question we had. An alum shared that she enjoyed reading Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle because she and her family grew what they ate or purchased only locally, raised or grown foods, which eliminated many foods like bananas from their diet because they aren't locally grown.
Right.
Trend going back to growing more, to people growing more of their own foods, raising chickens, etc. You kind of just touched on it. Do you see an exponential increase in these practices?
I don't know if it's exponential, but it's definitely increasing. So we're in a different situation here in 2020 than say 1990 or 1960. There is a pretty, I think, substantial proliferation of what sometimes are called alternative agricultural outlets or practices. We have more and more opportunities to work on these different forms of engagement. So they can be like economic engagement. You can buy different things, like you vote with your wallet, that kind of thing. It can be like physical engagement. You can donate your labor and you can work on local farms, or you can work in a community garden. It can be like intellectual or cultural engagement of being more attuned to the environmental dimensions of our food system. Like even those are different kinds of engagement that an industrial system generally seeks to discourage us from. They want to keep us just as a consumer. You shouldn't be asking any questions. I've been, since when the pandemic started, we started a reading group where we meet each week on Zoom of students who felt like they lost their attachment to the college farm. So we have this weekly food and farm studies salon, and it's become a weekly gathering where we'll read one or two articles that essentially have been all about racism in the food system and the racial structure of how we produce food, of how health standards differ, of who has access to food. And it's just an ongoing study. So even that, like I hold out hope and promote as much as I can the idea of cultural and intellectual engagement along with actual physical or economic engagement too.
Thank you. I have two more questions, and then maybe we can save a couple of minutes for Ron, who has the interesting stamp behind him.
Oh yeah.
Of something to share. I have someone who is willing to unmute themselves and ask their question. Foreman?
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Cohen, thank you for that lecture. That was fascinating. I am looking forward to reading your book. It's something that's fascinates me over the years is this subject. But the specific question I have is I'm not sure if you address in your book, and I'll kind of tip my hand and say that I read a lot of science and I'm a big fan of GMOs and the advances that we were making in GMO to feed more people, to make things less expensive, to to possibly even help increase nutrition, increase density of nutrition for people in their foods, in addition to making things that last longer and cost less to process and pack. It just seems like such an amazing subject and a huge subject, of course, to address. But I wanted to know if your book addressed that. And also my big issue is labeling that you speak about a lot. It seems almost that labeling a food GMO indicates to people that's bad. It doesn't indicate that just because it's GMO and it's labeled that way, I should still purchase the food. So it's a little bit disturbing to me when I see this legislation coming out that we need to label food and tell everybody it's GMO, when that to me sounds like we're just going to be telling everybody that's bad. So I just had what your thoughts were on that, but thank you for the lecture.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for the question. In the epilogue to the book, I talk about this, and I acknowledge in the epilogue that no question has come up more often in the years of me speaking about, when the book was in preparation, I'd be giving talks about it when I was doing research, is the GMO question was the most dominant one I had. And I took a read on that where I don't end up being pro or anti. I don't take a position on the validity of genetically modified organisms in the book. What concerns me is, and I write about this in the epilogue, is I was struck. The reason it fascinated me is I was struck that the debate about genetically modified organisms is so strongly similar to the debate about pure foods. So for me, as an analyst, as someone who's just not analyzing how people argue about it, as opposed to someone who's weighing in to say which is right and which is wrong, in the pure food debates, so often the argument would come down to, I don't like adulterated food because I'm being poisoned, or I don't like adulterated food because I'm being cheated. So it was either I'm cheated or poisoned. I don't like this as a consumer because you're stealing my money. I don't like this as an eater because I'm going to get sick. If you can show me that neither of those things are true, then I'm okay. Both of those questions assume our consumer identity. Both of those, or I should say, both of those answers to the debate. Am I being cheated or am I being poisoned? Those to me are on like one side of a spectrum. Those are both consumer questions. And that's what frustrates me a little bit with the GMO debates, is that we still, I think, have that. I don't know if GMOs are, I don't know if it's in my food and that's why I'm bothered, or I don't know if I'm being made sick by it and that's why I'm bothered. And in both of those cases, we accept that we are only consumers. So the point that I make in the book is trying to skirt the direct question of, are they good or bad? And to me, it's more of, how do we even ask these questions anymore? The structures of our eating lives have been defined so strongly as consumers that we don't even really have the possibility to ask about what this means for landscapes, or what it means for farmers, or what it means for thriving agrarian communities. So I give that answer not to dodge your question, but to acknowledge that it's so thorny that it just fascinates me that the way I'll see article after article about GMOs, it just sounds like it's straight from the late 1800s. So like a few minutes ago when I said I'm a continuous, like things seem largely the same to me over years and decades. Like this is an example of it. So that the actual science of genetic modification, no way do we have any sense of that 100 years ago. It had no role in the world. This is a more recent thing. So that's different, yes. But the way that we argue about its legitimacy, to me, feels trapped in an old form of argument. So that your points, I don't even know that we can really get to those points. I don't know who I mean by we, a public debate or policy arguments. It's hard to even get to your points in those big policy forums because we're trapped in this cheated versus poisoned framework. I don't know if that helps. You're still unmuted, right?
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. And I see what you're saying. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your book. And again, thank you for the lecture. My daughter is starting as a freshman this year at Lafayette, and I'm excited to continue to listen to some of these great talks. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. That was a good question.
Paul, would you like to ask your question? Or I can. Curious to know your opinion on the dietary supplement industry of the present day. It seems like it's a bit like the 19th century food industry as you describe it. Was it politics that created this dichotomy where the FDA was highly involved in food safety regulations but took a far less active approach with dietary supplements?
Short answer, yes. It was politics that created this dichotomy. Long answer, unsatisfying. I don't have a good answer to fully explain it. It does sound a lot like that industry, the caveat emptor period, buyer beware. The reason we developed policy and regulation over what was called the progressive era, from 1900 to 1918, was to try to get past the caveat emptor. Like, we need to actually protect the consumers. The buyer shouldn't have to beware. They should not be poisoned. I think we've slipped back that way in some ways through losses of certain regulatory oversight. And as some of the prior questions indicated, some of that loss of regulatory strength comes from growing distrust of the regulators themselves, even though the regulators were put into place to overcome the distrust of the generation before that. So we're stacking new forms of distrust on one another. And I don't have the best answer for how we get out of that. But I guess for the sake of consistency, I'll say one way that I hope we would try to approach getting out of that dynamic is to reinvest and build stronger environmental lives so we have a stronger basis to even ask these questions so that we don't need dietary supplements.
Thank you. We are quickly approaching 8. I appreciate we have a couple of more questions that have come in. I'm happy to share them with Ben so that we can address those after, but I did promise Ronald Lesher that he could just chat for a minute or two.
Yeah, I want to see these.
Okay. Well, first of all, 1886, we have the first legislation on oleomargarine, a tax of 4 cents per pound, and a legal definition of oleomargarine that it has to have the same fat content as butter. The dairy industry gets very active, and in 1902 convinces Congress to tax uncolored margarine, reducing that tax to a 0.5 cent per pound, but colored margarine is to be taxed at 10 cents per pound, essentially bringing the price of oleomargarine to the price of butter. Colored margarine was not illegal, but it was certainly far more expensive. I do remember in the late 1940s, the oleomargarine makers packaged oleomargarine, uncolored, in plastic bags with a little bead of red dye in it so that we could fight as kids as to who would break the little bead of color and and mix it in with the rest of the margarine to make it look yellow. That legal definition of same fat content as butter means that today I dare you to go into a store and find something that labels itself oleomargarine or margarine. We have become conscious of fat in our diets, and I do remember in the 1970s, one of the manufacturers, Fleischmann, came out with a new product which they called imitation oleomargarine. That is, it couldn't meet the legal definition of margarine because it had a lower fat content. The irony of all of this is that the coloring that was used by the oleomargarine manufacturers was exactly the same thing that the butter makers were using to color butter so it would be uniform in color year-round. They would use that during the winter when the cows were eating silage. So, and by the way, I do appreciate your book. I've only gotten through the first part, but it gives me a far larger context for the kinds of things that I've been collecting for many, many years. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. You would, I won't call it back up, but you'd appreciate that in that three-headed hydra, the snake with the three heads.
Yes.
You notice the oleomargarine has a bandage around his neck because the cartoon came out in 1887, and that bandage was the strike that the 1886 law had like struck its neck, so it was like limping.
There is a book that catalogs all of these oleomargarine stamps that was written by a fats chemist that worked at Rutgers, and he uses that same cartoon as the introduction to his book.
Yeah, that's where I found it.
Very good.
Yeah. What's his name? Carter something?
Carter Litchfield.
Yeah.
No longer alive.
Yeah, that was a very helpful book. No, thank you all. Claire, sorry that I answered your question before I got to answer your question. If you're still here, you can do the little clap thing on the screen.
Yes, we do have a couple other questions, Ben. I will send them to you following the session just to respect the hour for this ConnectED. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Ben, for presenting for us today and sharing the book. I'm going to put you on the spot. I did send you a private message. If anyone is interested in getting your book, would you be okay with what I suggested?
Offering a signed book plate to anyone who buys your book and lets us know, of course.
So there we go. I'll send it out in a follow-up, but if anyone, it sounds like some people may already have the book, we can work with Ben to get you a signed copy. There we go. I see one right there.
You can, Chris, you can tell them I'll sign as many copies as they buy.
There we go.
There's no limit.
So we can, we'll put something out afterwards, but thank you so much, Ben. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are doing a number of these ConnectED sessions. We've done a number. We actually have them recorded if you're interested in viewing past ones, and we have them coming up. Our next one is just next week. You can always go to leopardlink.lafayette.edu. The next one is called The Mindset Reset with Deb Cummings. Thank you again, and I do promise to we will go back to the questions that weren't able to get answered. So good night.
Thank you all. Thanks, Chris.